Well, thank you very much, Christopher. And that's a good reminder to me that you and we go all the way back to day dot. So, right when I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I did not know what the future held, or little did I know. Just as well, I might have given up and walked home at that time. But it's a joy for me to be a part of this today for Tasmanian Conference. We would have loved to be there in person at this time of year, but of course, with travel restrictions and coronavirus and all that kind of thing, we find ourselves in a situation where we can do it online. It's much more cost effective though, which is the other side of the coin, the positive side. But the negative side is that we can't be there with you in person. I want to back up a little bit and get a bit of a bird's eye view on some broader issues for my contribution today. Namely, I'd like to talk a little bit about truth. Christopher has mentioned that the motto, which was laid on my heart, which was from the scriptures and in Isaiah 59, and which has become ACL's motto in the last couple of years, is truth made public. And, the importance of that probably has been brought home to me all the more clearly with every passing month, every passing day that I have been in this job. And I think it was an inspired thing that God brought that motto to me and to ACL. And to begin, I want to share a good news story. We do have some good news stories. And the good news story from this week is the story of Katrina Tate. Now, Katrina is a mother from Brisbane, a young mother, and Katrina had shared a petition on her Facebook page. It was an ACL petition, and it had been launched by Wendy Francis up there in Queensland, opposing drag queen story time in Brisbane City Council libraries. And so when that petition was shared to her Facebook, she added this comment, and she said, "I can't believe I've just had to sign a petition to try and stop drag queen story time happening at libraries in our country. I can't believe this actually happened in Brisbane last weekend. What happened to protecting children's innocence and letting them just be kids? Why the need to have adult entertainers reading them stories? Hardly good role models, with many involved in drugs and prostitution, etc. Feeling scared for our children's future. Please sign and help save their innocence." Now, Katrina thought that she was sharing that to her friends and that would be the end of the matter. But a complaint was lodged against Katrina with the Anti-Discrimination Board of New South Wales, even though she's up in Brisbane. And an activist, a well-known activist, put in a complaint against her. But not only did he complain against her, saying that she had vilified homosexuals, even though she makes no mention of homosexuals in her post, but he also put out a media release in which he doxed her, which is the practice of releasing people's details publicly, their personal details, mobile phone number, and home address and things like this. And he said some things in that release like this. He said, "Katrina clearly does not understand the law, and in particular does not understand the provisions of the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act 1977. My advice to her is to stick to commenting on matters she understands. Fellas, I'm just like a vicious Alsatian dog. Once I grab hold of a gay hater's leg, I won't let go until the bone is bloodied and bare. One way or another, I will get a remedy from Katrina, even if it takes me years in court." So charming character, clearly. And Katrina actually received, believe it or not, I thought when that media release went out and this happened, I actually said to Katrina, I spoke to her on the phone and I said, "Oh, look, this one's probably a little bit too crazy, even for the Anti-Discrimination Board of New South Wales, even though they have picked up some pretty crazy cases. But this one, there's no mention of homosexuals on its face. It's rubbish." Nonetheless, she received a letter from the Anti-Discrimination Board of New South Wales to say that complaint was progressing. And so she was under threat of significant financial penalty and all the rest of it. So that causes a great deal of stress when people go through this. But we got behind her. The Human Rights Law Alliance, which is a sister organisation to ACL and funded by ACL as a law firm, which Christopher and I were involved in when it started. Christopher continues to help out. And they got behind Katrina and started giving her legal help. And the great news is that this week, we got news that the complaint has been dropped, which is often the case because, these complaints, once they get exposed to the light of day, they often get dropped. So Katrina has come out into the clear, and that shadow is no longer over her head. Now, I raise all of that. And by the way, she had good basis for concerns, because the drag queen story hour that occurred on the week before she shared that actually involved adult entertainers. One was a homosexual acted in homosexual pornography and had received an Adult Entertainers Award for that. Another one had a drag name that was sexually explicit, and it was a pretty valid concern that she did that. And so good on her for being a part of the voices opposed to that sort of thing happening in the Brisbane City Council libraries. But there's a lesson from this case which I reflected on, which I've noted before. Katrina's just one of the people that have been involved in these sorts of cases. We've currently got a West Australian couple, for example, who have been told that they can't become foster parents for children under the age of 6 because they are Christians, and they're Reformed Christians, and they have conservative Christian views on issues of sexuality and gender, and therefore they've been denied the right to be foster parents. That case is ongoing. Recently had the case of a Victorian medical doctor who had an investigation launched against him by the medical board without his knowledge, and they trawled up 14 odd years worth of his internet history, his social media activity, his comments on blogs, his writings, and they compiled a dossier of all his conservative opinions. And then they decided that he was unsafe to interact with patients who didn't share his conservative opinions, and therefore he was struck off and he lost his practicing certificate. And to this day, since August last year, his job has been over, effectively the end of his career. And he was dreadfully vilified as someone who was promoting genocide and all sorts of madness, which just isn't true. So I say that because there's more of these people, and this is a job that we're involved in, and the Human Rights Law Alliance is involved in quite a bit. But there's a common theme to all of these cases. I once thought that this was all about freedom, that the common theme was loss of freedoms. But I've since realised that this is probably about something a little bit deeper. I think that this is actually about truth. The people in these cases, time and time again, who are targeted, who find themselves being put under pressure, who find themselves dragged before tribunals, very often, in fact, nearly always, actually are there because they have stood up for, or at least tried to stand up for, truth. Somebody said to me once, would you take on a case that was a freedom of speech case or whatever that didn't involve, somebody who agreed with these ideas? So if it was a different religion, or if it was somebody who said so. And I said, look, in theory, we might. But they're very few and far between. Time and again, it's the people who attempt to stand for truth that get in trouble. For example, if you want to go out there and you want to tell a child that they could be a two-spirit, non-binary, genderqueer, it's very unlikely you're going to find yourself in front of an anti-discrimination tribunal. But it is those who do the sorts of things that Archbishop Julian Porteous did, as His Grace just spoke to us. And it was he who put out a very benign pastoral letter explaining the Catholic Church's views on something as simple as marriage. And he found himself pursued by an anti-discrimination body because he told the truth. And I think that's a very important revelation to have, because it's very consistent with so much of what we learn from the Bible and so much of what we know about the world. We live in an age when the truth is suppressed very often. Exactly a year ago today, I was in the media because we were sticking up for Israel Folau. And that was because he put his post on social media, a paraphrase of 1 Corinthians 6, 9-11. And I remember reading an article in the shadow of that case. And it was said by this commentator that, look, he should be free to say what he said, but of course what he said was preposterous. And the commentator went on to say, if those are the criteria for hell, then I'll see you down there. And he said, that's preposterous. And you see all of a sudden that the problem that fella had was with the message. And he was saying, this can't be right. It can't be true that someone as good as me would be judged by God and found wanting. And of course, that was the big problem that people had, a message that there might be judgment, a message that we might be found to fall short of the glory of God, as the scriptures say. And that is true of every one of us. And I believe every one of us was in the categories that Israel listed in his post. And that was the target of tremendous attack. But of course, you can still have rugby players who broke into family homes and did all and whatnot. And the guy who did that was in the running to be captain of the Broncos in Brisbane. You can have people who say the most horrific things about religion. They never face the troubles that Israel faced. And I see this time and again. In Tasmania, for example, there is exclusion zones legislation around abortion clinics, exclusion zone, bubble zones legislation passed to say that people cannot communicate on the subject of abortion in a way that can be seen or heard and is therefore, likely to cause distress, etc., within these 150-metre zones. And since those zones came in around the country, we've seen people hauled up for all kinds of conduct in those zones, everything from as benign as prayer, for example. You look at that and you think, well, it's interesting because the stated reasons for those zones was that our women are being harassed. And of course they weren't being harassed. And if they were, the police would already have ample power to do something about it. Of course, the only difference after those zones were brought in was that people were not able to peacefully, quietly, gently tell the truth about life near abortion clinics. And that was, I believe, the true target of that legislation. It's the same in New South Wales. Recently, a billboard went up with the simple slogan, "A heart beats at 4 weeks." It was the pro-life group Emily's Voice. There was a public outcry about that simple statement of, and note, truth. And it was the Transport Minister of New South Wales, Andrew Constance, who had that billboard removed, taken down. And that's extraordinary. But again, it's the truth. I remember last year we were involved in the successful battle against the legislation introduced by Penny Wong into the federal Senate, which would have made it impossible. Really, it would have made it very difficult, I should say, or it would have opened schools up to litigation for teaching the Bible on subjects particularly of controversy, like sexuality and things like that. And I thought that's very interesting. Why is this bill so specifically targeted to faith schools? And why is it so designed that this would be the likely outcome? And again, I realized, well, I went to a Christian school and it was a great blessing. And there were many people in my Christian school who were not Christians when they started at the school, but they were Christians when they finished at the school. And to undermine a Christian school's ability to teach truth and to undermine a Christian school's ability to stand on the truth, there's a very strategic side to that. And it is, as Paul says in 1 Timothy 2, something that stands in opposition to the knowledge of the truth. Paul says, pray for religious freedom, or pray for the godliness to be, lives of godliness to be peaceful and quiet, so that people might come to the knowledge of the truth, that it might spread without hindrance. And again, it's truth. And Paul speaks of truth in that context as well, being the issue, the ultimate issue at play. It's so important that we see this clearly, I think, because when we see it clearly, we understand what's going on and we understand what we should do about it. And we can ask questions about, the cultural changes we see around us and the things that concern us. And we can say, well, is this a libertarian issue? Is it just an issue of freedom in general? Or is this a Western culture issue? Do we need to get back to our roots and proclaim Judeo-Christian Western cultural values? Or is it a reason issue? Is it that people have rejected reason and become illogical? And do we need to, go and proclaim reason? I think that I'm going to come back to those questions in a minute, because I think that we find the answer to those questions in properly understanding what is the problem. And there is a far more specific target here. And it's not just me coming up with this. This is in Scripture. First of all, in Isaiah 59, the scripture that inspired me to create this motto, it says there that truth has stumbled in the public squares. And is that not exactly what I've just been describing? That biblical maxim, there's nothing new under the sun. And it's true, right? Even in Isaiah's time, thousands of years ago, he's lamenting the fact that truth has stumbled in the public squares. Same thing. And then you fast forward quite a long period of time to the New Testament, and you have there the Apostle Paul. And what does Paul say? Well, he says, people, and he's talking in chapter 1 of Romans about culture at large. He's talking about a godless culture. What's the society like? And he says they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And that's Romans chapter 1, verse 18. And when you look at the Greek, you often find that things are written in the imperfect tense. So not in the past tense, not in the present tense, not in the future tense, but they're written as continuing, ongoing. And that's how this phrase is written in the Greek. This is an ongoing enterprise of the life of people. When I was a kid, being in Queensland where I grew up, it was always very hot, and we'd swim a lot. And one of the things I used to like to do was to try and get things that were floating on the surface and make them touch the bottom of the pool. And one thing I could never achieve that with was a volleyball. They're very hard to get all the way down. And actually to hold it under the surface for any length of time took a bit of effort. And you sort of had to adjust yourself and, get your hands on it and try and hold it under the surface. And it took concentration, it took effort. And the revelation of Romans chapter 1 is that actually that's what people do with themselves, whether they realize it or not. It's an ongoing thing. It's personal, for example. What are the two great taboos in society? They are religion and politics. The two things that, go closest to questions of meaning and ultimate answers. People avoid this. They don't like it. I used to work in a busy law firm environment, and people would work their guts out. They'd work all day, every day. And then 5 o'clock on a Friday, they'd be off partying, and they would be mindless, out of their mind, from Friday afternoon through to the end of the weekend. And then they'd rinse and repeat and do all the work again. And, they'll deny it to the day they die, but there's an element there of suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. A pattern of life, a way of living, that holds the truth out of your mind. We've also seen it's not just personal, it's societal. And all the examples I gave refer to that. It's a societal thing. I worry sometimes that it's becoming a religious thing as well. And you see that where they say, if you speak truth, well, you're not being compassionate. If you speak truth, you're not being loving. And of course, they completely forget the fact that you cannot have love without truth. You cannot have compassion without truth. If you want to help somebody, you need to bring the truth into the situation so you know what's wrong, so you can give real answers. This issue of avoiding truth is so common. And we're told here that people do this actually because the truth about things is threatening to us. The truth about God is threatening. The truth about God can invoke, for example, guilt. The truth about God brings us closer to uncomfortable answers to things that we don't like. Romans 1 says, well, the truth about God, what it does is it dethrones us because we find out that God is the creator and God is great and we are not. And as Romans 1:25 says, what would we rather do? We'd rather worship ourselves. We would rather exchange the truth about God for the lie and worship and serve creature rather than creator, it says in Romans 1:25. And that is seen absolutely everywhere, where actually the thing we're doing in suppressing the truth and holding down the truth, and the thing that society is doing in this modern age, is that they are holding down the truth ultimately so that they can hold themselves up and sit even in the seat of the creator. One way I see that is, in Tasmania, you have some of the most draconian vilification laws in the country. And somebody said a while ago, and it was singularly interesting to me, we used to have blasphemy laws where you couldn't insult God. But now, of course, you have laws where you can't insult people, and you can't insult them on all sorts of grounds. And you see there's a real shift going on in terms of what we consider highest and most holy and worthy among us. We see it in gender, this idea that we get to say, we raise ourselves up. I'm 6'7", but I'm a woman, and there's nothing you can say about it. And you've got to call me she. And the Tasmanian laws actually say that, and no one's tried this yet to my knowledge to actually sue on this basis, but they actually say that mispronouncing somebody could amount to offensive conduct under the law. And that's this tendency in Romans 1 to raise ourselves up even to the point of being creators. We see it in euthanasia, and much has been said about euthanasia this afternoon. Or is it still morning? Where are we? It's still morning by 10 minutes. But as much has been said about euthanasia this morning, the control of even our very lives to take godlike authority over when we exit this life or when we decide that we've had enough. That again is this same impulse that we see in Romans 1. We see it in what I call the worship of self generation. You listen to the language, you hear about self-care, self-discovery, self-expression, self-confidence, self-esteem, and we all take selfies. This language is all around us, the turning into the self, the desire that self would even write the laws of right and wrong. It's not truth anymore, it's truth to me, or more likely, my feelings. It's not beauty anymore, it's I am beautiful. You're all beautiful. One of the first things I say to young people when I talk to them is, well, you might not be beautiful. We've got to start thinking logically and objectively about these things. We have turned so in on self and raised self up, and you hear that word identity so often. It's all around us. I always say asking a question about your identity is really the wrong question, because we're made in the image of God, and we should ask, who is God? And then we'll find out who we are. There's that turning away from the vertical, and there's that elevating of the self, but it manifests itself in us saying what we want and pursuing our own ways. But 2 points to finish off with. The first one is, I think we need to see something, and that is that this way of thinking has a tremendous cost, and it's destroying people and it's hurting people. And then I think I need to say before I finish that it is incumbent therefore on us to be the voices that cut through and do something about this. The cost that I speak of is everywhere. In Isaiah 59, it says, when truth stumbles in the public squares, there's no justice. Because, of course, the truth about what is right and what is wrong is lost, and there can be no justice. And when injustice starts to come into a society, it's very sad. It's very tragic. You see in Romans 1 that there's that statement, the wrath of God is revealed against ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Again, a continuing thing. It's now, it's here. And that sounds very, very Old Testament and very, passionate fire and brimstone preaching. But it's actually a mere statement that people suffer now because of living this way, because of denying the truth that God has given. And living with themselves in the seat of the Creator and in the seat of God, even to write the rules of morality, to write the rules of reality. And it has a great cost. I'll never forget the story of Walt Heyer, one of the first gender reassignment patients in the world in the 1950s. He was a guy who suffered because of that lie that we're all dealing with, that there's no man and woman, there's no male and female. It's everything and anything in between, or whatever your mind can invent is your gender identity and your gender expression. And Walt went through this pathway of surgery, hormones, all the rest of it. He became a woman and lived as a woman for a number of years. And like so many people in Walt's situation, he found that this didn't solve his problems. And it's a miracle that he did not commit suicide, but instead he found Jesus, and instead he became a Christian. And he detransitioned as much as you can from those procedures. And now he runs this transgender regret counseling ministry. And he travels the world speaking to people who have been through gender reassignment and are suffering. And he speaks to them and helps them. And he says, in more than 50% of cases, they'll tell him that, the real problem was sexual abuse as a child. In about 40% of the rest of the cases, they'll talk about comorbidities like psychosis and autism and various other things. And, here is suffering, real pain, and lies are making it worse. Instead of helping children, they get scalpels, they get hormones. And this is a real tragedy all around us. You see the cost then of living this way, of embracing this and denying truth. One of the things that shocked me in recent times was reading just the testimonials, for example, of post-abortive women who bought the lie that this is just a clump of cells and you can have power over your body and you can destroy this life and you'll be fine. And of course, the harrowing testimonials that they tell of the psychological impacts and the struggles they had in life because of that, and many who found the answer in the Lord Jesus and turned in salvation. But just an incredible sadness that lies over that issue. I also say, the way we live these days, we think we get away with it. We have modern sexual health clinics that mask the consequences of our lives and living our own way and living in denial of what God has said. But we don't really get away with it because we are the most depressed and anxious generation the West has ever seen. It wreaks a havoc on our psychology. And that's one of the great crises in the world all around us. And I really believe that the answer is what Paul has said in Romans 1. It's because we've forgotten God and our very psychology is fragmenting and is so damaged. This is something that has a great cost in society. But now that I've brought us all very low with the cost, I want to raise us up with the answer. And I think that this is where we all come in. We must carry the answers in this generation and in this time. And I think God looks for people in every generation to carry the answers that he can use to achieve things in the face of so much opposition and difficulty. Understanding what to do is crucial. And I go back to the point, was it that we rejected culture? Or is it a loss of freedom? Or is it a loss of reason? No, it's something more than that. The answer is, as Paul says, he says, we've rejected truth because we've rejected God. He starts with ungodliness. And the answer, therefore, is to point men and women in this society to God, and it is to point men and women to God's ways. Notice I said and, not or. I think sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking we can point to God's ways and that's the end of the matter. It's not quite. It's a wonderful thing to do and we all must do it. But if there's an opportunity to go further and point people further to God, we should always seek it. We should always take it. And the Apostle Paul tells us how. In Romans 1 here, he gives this little diagnosis that I've sort of sketched out a bit and just touched on and started to explain. But then he goes on to say, he says, this is why. Because of all this. This is why I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of God for salvation to all who believe. And then he goes and writes an entire book about the gospel. And it's 16 whole chapters. And he says an awful lot in that book. And it's very instructive. There's some people who want to narrow the gospel down really, really tight. And there's others who want to make it into something different. Well, Paul actually explains it in a very broad way. And he starts by saying, do you know what? In explaining the gospel, I have to tell you firstly about society in Romans 1. And Romans 2 and the brokenness of society and the sin in society. Then he says, I need to tell you about you in Romans 3 and your sin and your brokenness and your falling short and all that. And then he says, now I need to tell you about faith in Romans chapter 4. And then he says, now I need to tell you about the being right with God by faith in chapter 5. And then he says in chapter 6 and 7, he gives some examples of living out, the righteousness that we're called to and the struggles that might entail. But he eventually gets to chapter 12. And in chapter 12, he starts to talk about what a transformed life looks like. So he's talked all about the righteousness of God revealed in the gospel. And then he talks all about the righteousness of God that can be revealed through us as those that have been saved by the gospel. And that's Romans 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. And he sits there and all of a sudden he starts telling us what to do. And he hasn't told us to do anything up until chapter 12. And suddenly he says, therefore, have through the therefore he says, render your whole lives as living sacrifices to God, transform and renew your minds, and do this and do this and do this. And he covers everything you can imagine. He even covers our relationship to the government and the state in chapter 13, all in that section. I think what Paul is telling us is he's saying, look, here's what the gospel is. I'm going to speak the gospel, which is the theological truths of the gospel and God and Christ and all that he's done. And then he says, also, I'm going to show you to live the gospel, which is the transformed life that you have in front of other people. And he says, I want you to speak that, and I want you to live that through transformed lives as much as you ever can. And that's the answer. And I think we should settle for absolutely nothing less. Yes, we should live that life in public. Yes, we should speak those truths and point people to God's ways. But I love to get the opportunity to do even more than that. And sometimes people look through us and they can see something greater and we get the chance to point them to God himself. I think we should always be open to that. We must always be open to that because that's the whole answer. And so I want to leave us by saying we should be people who do that, because the real problem in this age is the loss of truth. The loss of truth about what's right, and the loss of truth about who God is and what God has done. And it's only those things through God's people that will change and transform everything. But let me note one thing before I shut up, and that is this. Jesus tells us what to expect when we do this. Because he does say, he says, you're the light of the world. You're the salt of the world. Go out there and shine the light. Go out there and stop the decay. And that's what I trust we're all compelled to do. And he says, and when you do it, he couches it between two statements. One is the warning that you will be persecuted. You will face hostility and opposition for what you do. And he says, people will revile you, they will reject you. And, very often in fear of that, we censor ourselves, or we do less, or we put the light under the basket, or we don't get past the Romans 12 and start living as we ought, or we don't do the first part of Romans and start proclaiming the things we ought to proclaim. It's so important, that we realize the second part of Jesus' statement where he says, yeah, that'll happen. But then he says at the end of that section, he says, and people will see your good works and they will give glory to your Father who's in heaven. If the light's not on, it cannot have an effect. If we're not pointing people to the truth, they will never see the truth. If we're not pointing people to God's ways, they'll never know what God's ways look like. If we're not pointing people to God himself, they may never know God. And this is the important thing. There will be the hostility and there will be the increase and the blessing. And we need to temper our expectations in a fallen world, that you will get both, because God is at work in the fallen world by his power, but also the world is fallen. And you will also see that great opposition. And so I want to encourage us to say with Paul, look, this is something that we need the power of God for, and the power of God is at work, if we're but faithful, to go out there in the face of many lies and a great cost, but to do so and be those through whom the truth is lived, through whom the truth is spoken in all things and in all ways. So thank you very much. That's me. Done.